The first thing we want to notice when we look at this problem is where the limit is headed. And so as you look down here, this problem has a limit as x is headed to infinity. So when I'm talking about infinite limits, that immediately tells me that I only really have to worry about three options on how this problem could work out. And all those options are based upon where you would find what I call the dominant term. So usually it's the highest power of x. It's going to be the term that leads the behavior for this graph. Over very, very, very large values of x. And so as you think about it, like the dominant term, something like x to the third would get huge, but something like x to the fifth as it gets larger is going to get even bigger than this x to the third. So your dominant term in a situation like that would be x to the fifth. The next piece of this is determining where that dominant term is. And so really you have three options on what you're looking at. Option one is what I just referred to as a top-heavy situation. And so what that means in my world is that the dominant term is on the top of the fraction. So if we had something like the limit as x heads to infinity of 7x to the fifth minus 3x cubed over 4x squared plus 5x. In this situation here, the dominant term, the term that's going to lead the behavior, is going to be this x to the fifth term right here, because that's our largest power of x over the entire equation, and it only shows up on top. And so essentially what this is saying is that our graph is growing up on top, headed off to infinity, and really there's nothing the bottom of this fraction can do to stop it. The one thing to worry about when you come through this, because your answer is going to be infinity, but now you got to determine if it's going towards positive or negative infinity. And to do that, you just want to look at your highest power, and if it's x to the fifth and you're working towards positive infinity, well, the sign doesn't change, and so that heads to infinity. If you've got x to the fifth and you're headed to negative infinity, well, in that situation, the negative on that is going to stick around because anything to the fifth power, anything to an odd power, keeps its sign. And then the last little piece you would want to look out for is, what's going on in front of that. If that was a negative 7, you'd be looking at this thing headed to negative infinity. And if this thing had a negative on here, then that negative would end up giving you a positive. So the answer is it's going to be headed to infinity, and then you just got to check the signs on whether it's going to positive or negative infinity. Option 2 in this situation would be what I call a bottom-heavy scenario. And so that just means that the dominant term only appears on the bottom of our fraction. So if we kind of flip-flop that example we were just looking at and put what was on bottom on top and what was on top on bottom, now what you see here, again, dominant term is going to be that x to the fifth term sitting on bottom right here. And in this scenario, what that's telling us is that the bottom of this fraction is getting huge, and there's nothing the top can do to stop it. So if you think about it, that's like a decimal point with a ton of zeros, right, before you would get to whatever that value is, which as it gets bigger and bigger is essentially headed to 0. So whenever you have a dominant term that's only on the bottom and you're dealing with a bottom-heavy scenario, you're always going to be headed to 0. And the nice thing is you don't have to worry about whether it's going to positive or negative infinity. It's just going to be headed to 0. And then our third option here is just what I would call balanced. And what I mean by that is that we have equal dominant terms on the top and the bottom. And so what you would see here is you've got 4x to the fifth plus 5x, and that's over 7x to the fifth minus 3x to the third. Here in this situation, we have equal dominant terms on top and bottom. X to the fifth is an equal amount of dominance. And so what that means is the top is growing, but it's always getting multiplied by a 4. And the bottom is keeping up with it, but it's also always being multiplied by a 7. So in the end here, what you'd be looking at in a balanced situation is always going to be the coefficients of those dominant terms. So going back to our specific problem here, and we say to ourselves, okay, well, what do I need to do here? Because I've got stuff that isn't quite multiplied out. I've got a bunch of terms that still need to be multiplied together. Well, the only thing you need to worry about is really the highest power from each of those terms. You don't need to do all the foiling, all the multiplying out, because in the end, the highest power is always just going to come from grabbing the highest power from each one of these two and multiplying those together. So really on the top right now, we have the limit as x approaches infinity, and as far as we need to worry about it, we just need to worry about what's going to make the highest power. So 3x times negative x would get us negative 3x squared. And then we go to the bottom and play the same game, and we say, okay, well the highest power here is an x and here's an x, so x times x is going to give us x squared. Now we know what our dominant terms are. We didn't have to do all the multiplication, which saves us some time, which is always helpful on an AP Calc test. From here, we go ahead and see that what we've got is option 3 going on. We have equal dominant terms on top and bottom. So that means it's going to be the coefficients of those terms that give us our answer. So that's a negative 3 on top. There's that unwritten 1 on bottom. And in the end, we head to negative 3. So the final answer on something like this says the limit as x heads to infinity of our original equation is that our graph is headed to negative 3, specifically y equals negative 3. So our answer would be right there. Thanks for watching my video. If you liked it, please click that like button and subscribe. And also share it with your friends and anyone else you know who might be crying about an upcoming AP Calc test. You can find more videos from me, more sample AP Calc questions, and my complete AP Calc study guide over at my website, apcalcprep.com. Have a great one.